one of the challenges with virtual reality gaming is you can't move anywhere, right? And I don't know if you've ever played these VR games where you do have to move around. There's some sort of UX where you point and click at stuff and you kind of like teleport there, and the movement's a little bit janky, and it also feels horrible to leave the VR. You forget how to walk. I remember going into this VR session for like 40 minutes, and then you come out into the real world. And I remember this distinct moment when I'm standing there at a traffic light and I'm like trying to press the button to like signal that I'm a pedestrian waiting to cross. And I just stared at it for maybe like 2 seconds longer than I should have, just like mentally trying to just magically touch the button. And then I'm like, oh shit, I actually need to reach my hand out and physically touch the button. The misogi. The idea of do something really hard. Like the only rules are make it really hard and don't die. Gives you an idea about the sense of the limit. There's this guy at my gym. He used to be in the British military and he did several tours of Afghanistan. So he's a pretty hardcore kind of guy. I knew of him because at some point he had done like a 48-hour sled push. He was saying that his present to himself is he's joined this race across the Arctic, 300 miles, and you're only allowed to take with you what you can carry. And what you're paying for is essentially the emergency team that's on the sidelines. And if you stop for more than 30 minutes, they call you to make sure you're not dead. That feels like peak misogi.
So, do you know what we're doing today?
Do you have something special planned? Are you teeing me up?
No. I've got one big thing, well, relatively big. I just wanted to talk about the science of it a little bit. So I finished reviewing the rapid maturation stuff that I was talking about of whiskey.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
Yeah. So I finished researching it and having a look into it. So I wanted to present my findings to you in the audience. And then the other thing was just like a really quick one. Like, have you heard of the Disney Holotle? Have you seen it?
Yes, I have. It looks freaking sick.
So I might just quickly show it. I'm guessing we're just starting.
Did you come across this because of that reviewer that has been like all over Twitter because he's hating on all these AI things, and then he reviewed this and it was like, I don't know.
Well, is that reviewer Marques Brownlee?
Yes.
Okay, well.
Yes.
Yeah, I saw his video. That's how I found out about it. But what I like about it, I just thought the engineering is quite smart. So, do you know how it works exactly?
I mean, I wouldn't say exactly, but I saw the original demo maybe 1 or 2 months ago when they first dropped it. And it's one of those things where you see it, like, that actually makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
Like, have the floor move underneath you and have it be made of, like, these independent rollers that can all go in different directions based on what you're doing.
So the rollers are spinning like Beyblades. They're not like spinning like a wheel, right? Which I think is interesting. And so the engineering is such that the Beyblade or like the spinning top basically tilts either side. And so only the edge that's sort of going in the direction you want it to go will touch your foot. And so you basically have 8 or 9 of these like spinning blades all tilted to the right, for example, and that would push you forward, right? And I thought that was cool. So it's such a simple concept, but it made so much sense once they explained it. I think, yeah, here's where they explain it. So the spinning tops, you know what, Marquez is getting his plug anyway down here from a big creator like us. So
yeah, he needs it with his 18.8 million subscribers.
So you can see only this part of the spinning top actually touches the foot, and then will move you in the direction that you need to go into. Very cool. I thought this is awesome. It kind of made me think like, fuck, I wouldn't mind working at Disney's Imagineering team. Sounds really
That was something that I found really surprising about this, was if you had asked me which company is going to release this, Disney would not have even appeared on the list. Like, I didn't even realize they were in this space. Why are they in this space? Why did you know anything about this? Like, why is this a Disney thing?
I had no idea, but I do think that they did a lot for their recruitment drive with this video, and like some of the stuff that came out. I'm sure a lot of engineers were like, "Oh, that's really cool. Maybe Disney is somewhere I should go work." So they definitely did something there, I think.
Disney does do a lot of like guerrilla marketing for what it's like to work there.
Yeah,
but I mean, even if they got this into a productionized version, some of the applications are fairly obvious, right? Like gaming. One of the challenges with like virtual reality gaming is you can't move anywhere, right? And I don't know if you've ever played these VR games where you do have to move around, and there's essentially one of two options. One is you sort of like point and click. So there's some sort of UX where you point and click at stuff and you kind of like teleport there, and the movement's a little bit janky. And it also feels horrible to leave the VR because you forget how to walk. I remember going into this VR session for like 40 minutes, bumbling around for 15, and then you kind of get used to it, and then you come out into the real world. And I remember this distinct moment when I'm standing there at a traffic light and I'm like trying to press the button to like signal that I'm a pedestrian waiting to cross. And I just stared at it for maybe like 2 seconds longer than I should have, just like mentally trying to just magically touch the button. And then I'm like, oh shit, I actually need to reach my hand out and physically touch the button. But then there's the other side of VR, which is like, I think you and I did this actually ages ago.
Yeah, I feel like we've said this story before when we went to zero latency and you were telling me this exact story with the traffic light. So yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah, so the other version is like the zero latency style thing where you're literally just in a massive warehouse, so you can kind of run around without too much discrepancy. But for something at home, the Holotle is obviously that next attempt at doing movement without actually having to be able to physically move.
Yeah, I think it's just going to come with the biological side of, when you read and you're moving in a car, there's that feeling. And I think he was sort of describing the fact that like being on this thing it's hard to dissociate. Like your brain feels like you're not actually moving, but then you're moving, and it's just really confusing for it. So I think that's
there's still that uncanny valley.
Yeah. And I don't know, if that goes away.
Surely it would just feel like a treadmill. Like once it gets to super good quality, it would just feel like a treadmill in any direction.
Yeah, I can see that. But I think on a treadmill, there's no dissociation between you not moving and moving, right? In some sense. Like, you know that you're not moving and, like, it's fine. Whereas I feel like in the game, it may be a little bit more confusing.
Oh, we're just going to have to buy it and see.
Fair enough. Did you end up getting the Apple Vision Pro?
I didn't, no, but only because I have literally not had the time to physically go into the Apple store. And because apparently, like when you do it online, they're like, we recommend that you actually come in if you can, because you want to get like they've got like a measuring thing, so you can get a head strap that's the right size. And so TLDRs, I have not done that yet.
Okay, fair enough.
I've reached peak founder productivity, which is where whenever something's happening on my screen, I have no idea where it's happening because I've got like 6 different windows, like full screen, like programming windows open, and I just are constantly confused. That's how I know I'm being productive.
Yeah, you're being efficient, but not effective, unfortunately.
Maybe the other way around. I hope.
Well,
I pray.
In my principles document, you should go check it out, Ajay's Quest/models. There's a principle called be effective, not efficient. Efficient is just like how much shit can you get through, and effective is like picking the right thing to do and then doing that. And so, don't be like Loong. Don't have 6 windows open. Just pick one and just do that.
I highly recommend like real plug for AJ's principles. You sent that to me and it absolutely sniped me. I just like opened it and I was gonna have a quick peruse, and I ended up going through like every single one and reading them. Some of them are pretty good.
Okay.
Some of them are pretty good. What is it? The Misogi? Misogi? Misogi.
Yeah, Misogi.
I don't know. However the Japanese people would say it. The idea of do something really hard, and the only rules are make it really hard and don't die. So that's just like gives you an idea about the sense that the limit is meant to be so hard that you need an explicit rule to make sure it's not literally kill yourself hard.
Yeah, that one I heard in a podcast, but they found it from somewhere else, and I thought that was a really cool concept. And I've been thinking about what I could do, but I haven't come up with an idea that's like interesting enough for me to actually get behind. Do you have an idea?
There's this guy at my gym he used to be in the British military and he did several tours of Afghanistan. So he's a pretty hardcore kind of guy. And I knew of him because at some point he had done like a 48-hour sled push, just 48 hours straight of pushing a sled at the gym. And it was like this sort of big thing in the fitness community here in Singapore. And he was my replacement trainer one day. And I was just chatting with him, and he's turning 40. And he was saying that his present to himself is he's joined this race across the Arctic, 300 miles, and you're only allowed to take with you what you can carry. So your food, your sleeping, your whatever, that's just what you can bring with you. And you basically have an EPIRB and like a signal tracker. And what you're paying for is essentially the emergency team that's on the sidelines. And if you stop for more than 30 minutes, they call you to make sure you're not dead. And I don't know if I will ever be game enough to do that, but that feels like peak Misogi. Like,
yeah, that's exactly what it is. Yeah. Okay, that's the benchmark. We're just gonna scale it down.
Yeah,
50%.
everything else feels pathetic by comparison to that.
Oh man. Yeah, here I was thinking about doing Tough Mudder, which is not like just run 10
I'm doing High
days
Rocks
like...
in the end of June. That's my version, I guess.
High Ropes.
High Rocks. It's like this. There's like 8 stations, and you run a kilometer before each station, and the stations are pretty rough themselves. So we'll see.
That sounds like a decent try.
Yeah,
you'll get it next time. Yeah,
I'll get across the Arctic next time.
Yeah.
That's future Loong's problem.
Okay,
you wanted to climb Everest, didn't you?
Yeah, I was. Maybe one day when Everest is fully colonized and has like an elevator that goes to the top. Yeah, for sure.
Where do you want to start? Wherever, man. We can start with whiskey if you want, and then go into some of the little stuff, or we can start with the little stuff and then finish on whiskey.
Let's jump into the whiskey stuff. So, how much do you know about maturing alcohol in general?
Zero, other than you need sugar, and if you have sugar, you can do just about anything.
Okay, so first of all, I'm going to shout out Gary Spedding, PhD, who is a brewing and distillery analytical chemist. He's the one who did this whole 3-part series on like maturation and rapid maturation, and a lot of what I got was from his articles. So I'm going to say it a lot more simply because it's 50, 60 pages of like very dense stuff that he wrote, which is amazing. But I'm going to save you guys the time to sort of try to simplify it all. So essentially, what you're doing with aging is you're putting a solvent mix of water and ethanol, what you brew, and then you put it in usually a barrel that's made of some kind of wood. Most times it's oak, and it's extracting the flavor and the colors from the wood, essentially. And there's a bunch of other processes happening in that process at that time as well. Now, before I get into the process,
can I ask you a question? So you put the water and the ethanol in immediately. I thought the brewing process or the distilling process created the ethanol.
Correct. Yeah, and then you shove it in a barrel. So I'm saying.
Oh, okay.
Yeah,
right.
The product of that goes into a barrel. So I'm talking about the maturation process itself. Now, before I get into the process, there were 2 concepts that kept coming up. It was just like the flavor increases its richness and complexity, and I was like, what does that mean? Because it kept saying that over and over again. And so I just asked the AI to explain what richness and complexity mean. What would you think they mean? Like, I guess just off the bat.
Off the top of my head, I would say there are like, what is it? There's meant to be 6 distinct types of flavors your taste buds can pick up on. And so I would just say that you're creating more molecules that are hitting more of those different like taste types. Because there's like sweet, sour, bitter, umami. I'm not going to remember them all. But yeah, there's like a series of categories. So I would just guess that you're hitting different flavor, like you're developing different molecules that are hitting more of those different categories of taste buds. That would be my best guess, but I don't know.
Okay, well, this is what the AI told me, which is richness refers to the full, satisfying quality of the spirit. Descriptors for richness is velvety, a texture that feels very smooth and luxurious, soft on the palate, robust, lush, creamy. Like those are sort of the descriptors for the richness of a particular alcohol or spirit. And then complexity refers to the layers or the range of flavors you feel over time. So you may have a layered whiskey where the flavors unfold in stages, where you have a note at the start and then it goes to a different note. Or it's nuanced, which is subtle variations in the flavor. Intricate, multifaceted. These are some of the words you may use to describe your whiskey next time if you want to sound very smart. But to be honest, even after all that, I was kind of like, okay.
I feel like that just regresses the question, right? When someone says, "Oh, this whiskey tastes creamy," and be like, "What does that mean?"
Yeah.
Like
Well, I just wanted to dive a little bit deeper before I talk about the process, because all it really says is that these processes increase the richness and complexity of the flavor, right? And so I'm not going to go into the depth of the flavor because I don't understand flavor science at this point, so I'm not going to cover it. Now, you put the alcohol of the spirit in an oak barrel, typically, and the chemical interactions that occur is extraction. So the alcohol in the spirit extracts the flavors and the color from wood. So this includes things like tannins, which add bitterness and some complexity to the flavor. and color compounds, which is why typically, things like whiskeys go golden to deep amber, right? So that's called extraction.
They get their color from the actual, like, this maturation process.
Correct. So initially it's just clear, and then you put it in wood, and it gets the color.
I actually did not know that.
Yeah. Then you have oxidation. So oak is semi-porous, so air can flow in, but it's a very slow oxidation process. So it's not fully insulated from air, which allows it to oxidate over time, which apparently helps mellow the harsh flavors, right? So typically, if you drink distilled spirits straight out, it's going to be very harsh, but it mellows out over time due to oxidation. And then you have evaporation, which I'm sure you're familiar with, that when you put in a liter into a barrel, it's not going to be a liter out once you finish maturing it, right? Because it evaporates over time. So you lose a little bit through evaporation. So those are the three main chemical interactions. And then there's three main chemical reactions happening. The first one is esterification, which is the acids and alcohol in the spirits combine to form esters, which essentially are the aromatic compounds that make it fruity, floral, or creamy. Again, richness, right? You have hydrolysis.
But esters are just the nose, right? That's just the smell.
Yes.
Can we taste esters?
I'm not sure. It says aromatic specifically, but possibly. Then you have hydrolysis, which is any chemical that is instigated by water. In this case, the wood-derived compounds are broken down by water, which changes the flavor again. And then the Maillard reaction, which is what happens when you brown food, when you cook it, typically. So in this case, it's reducing the sugars, and there's a reaction between the amino acids, right, which changes the flavor again. So those are the three chemical reactions. Any questions so far?
No, but I think it's worth clarifying, because I was actually not on top of this at the very beginning, is that we're talking about two distinct phases, right? Like the first phase of developing an alcohol from scratch is that you put a bunch of shit in a container, and that creates the alcohol, right? There's a fermentation process that creates the original concoction, and that's where the alcohol comes from. Take a bunch of grapes and some sugar and you chuck it into a container, and you get sort of like the basis of your wine. But then you're talking about a completely distinct process, which is once you've got that, you chuck it in a sherry barrel, and you age it there for 20 years to get those flavors out.
Yeah.
So, we're specifically talking about whiskey here.
Yeah. First you ferment it, then you distill it, which is just to refine the alcohol a bit, and then you shove it in a barrel for anywhere from 1 to 30 years, depending on the type of spirit and how long you want to ferment to age it for. And then all these things happen, which is actually very correlated to the wood and the barrel that you put it in.
Yeah. So whiskeys are often aged in wine, like old wine barrels, right?
Yeah, sometimes. Yeah, which can change stuff as well.
So maybe I'm getting ahead of your explanation, but what's the difference between single malt, double malt? Is that part of this process, or is that a different thing? Is there a maximum, minimum amount of aging that makes sense to do?
Okay, so I won't get into the malt stuff, but to very quickly answer the question, it's just the types of sugars that you use to ferment in the first place, right?
So that's fermentation, not maturation.
Yeah. But you can have different kinds of barrels. You can put different things to ferment, to age it with as well, to add different flavors. There's all kinds of stuff you can do. In terms of the length of maturation, it can be anywhere from 5 to 30 years, and that's very dependent on the type of alcohol, the type of spirit you're making, the barrel, the climate. There's so many different things that might impact that. And also there is a point of diminishing returns. At some point, you may...
My understanding was that that's at 30-ish, 35 years. Is beyond that, the alcohol starts going bad.
Yeah, apparently for whiskeys it's actually 20 years. And for cognac, I believe it's 30 years.
That's crazy, because there's a whiskey that was poured in 1968, and they cast these containers into the pistons of an Aston Martin. So they got I think it's 150 of them or something like that. And they made these bottles, these glass bottles that were cast into a real Aston Martin piston from the assembly line. And they, it was the year of the collaboration, so they took the whiskey that they had made that year, and poured it in. Obviously, that's 55 years ago. So well and truly spoiled. But these single bottles now go at auction for $125,000 US. These things are fucking insanely expensive. It's all bullshit, right? You'd never drink that. Even if you did, it would taste disgusting.
Potentially. I'm not sure what factors may allow it to last longer. There is potential for that. Because I have seen whiskeys that are 30 years, right? But to that point, I don't actually know if they keep it in the barrel for that long, or if they keep it out of an oxygenated area, where it doesn't oxidize as fast. I don't know what they're doing there. But this is just the very high level numbers of what it might look like. Yeah.
Okay.
So interesting notes. Temperature fluctuations cause the wood to expand and contract, which, as you can probably tell, it impacts the way that the spirit would penetrate into the wood, right? The depth of it. Humidity also impacts it because it may slow or speed up the evaporation of water, right? Which would impact the spirit's strength.
Well, wouldn't the alcohol evaporate before the water? Because alcohol has a lower evaporation point than water.
That's a good question. I don't.
So if you really want to look like a whiskey asshole, the next time you drink a fancy whiskey, apparently the thing to do is you dip your finger in it and you actually air it off on your fingers and let the alcohol evaporate, and then you smell it. That's how you get the real notes of a whiskey, because it helps that harsher alcohol dissipate, and then you can get the actual flavors, because alcohol happily evaporates at room temperature, much more so than water.
Good to know. I'm clearly not well versed in chemistry or whiskey for that matter, and I decided that this is a topic that I found interesting. The only claim to fame is that I've spent over 2 hours researching this, which it's quite a lot for me.
I've spent over 2 hours drinking whiskey, so I think together we.
Okay, so let's talk about rapid maturation. So the background here is that back in 1937, the Shenley Research Institute started the whole process of trying to investigate rapid maturation. So this has been around for ages because it makes sense. Even back then, they were trying to nickel and dime and make more money, which if you're going to wait 20, 30 years, obviously that's very expensive. And if you can speed that up, anyone would pay money to do it. So we've been trying it for 80 years. Back then in 1937, they came up with 11 characteristics for bourbon and rye whiskeys, which included things like alcohol content, color, complexities of the esters and aldehydes. However, now obviously we found out that there's a lot more that sort of happens. It's very tricky to figure out exactly what's happening. And so fast forward to today, I think the general consensus is that it's very hard to figure out exactly what's happening over this period of time, because there's so many different factors that can impact the way that the aging happens, right? So we just talked about temperature, humidity, and if you want a very specific taste, it's very hard to replicate every single time, right? So a lot of the premium whiskeys is good because you have that variation that occurs, right? So you have one batch that tastes like this, another batch that tastes like that. And so it's been very difficult to do rapid maturation. And that's essentially what the consensus of, well, I guess the thesis of the article that Gary was sort of going through. There is a company here in Australia called Elton Spirits that do rapidly matured whiskeys and different alcohols, but they haven't really told us how they do it. It's just their proprietary. They have a reactor, right? They still use oak barrels, but they have a reactor that helps them do the entire thing. And so I started Googling how one would rapidly mature something. And there's 3 things that came up. And I guess off the bat, do you have any ideas on how you would speed up a reaction?
Chuck a bunch of enzymes in there.
Okay. Any non-chemical ways you would do it?
Everything's chemicals, Ajay.
Yeah, fair enough. So one solution, which is the simplest solution, is smaller barrels, because your surface area to volume ratio changes, right? If you have small barrels, which I was like, oh, okay,
just
that
shake
makes
it
sense.
up. Just put it in a shaker.
Yeah. Well, it's funny you say that, because what happens if you start shaking it really, 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 really fast?
It's going to aerate.
No, we have ultrasonic, right?
Oh, okay, really fucking fast.
So, it went from small barrels to maturing at higher temperatures, which I thought made sense too. If you heat things up, things move faster, and chemicals, more kinetic energy, right? The final one was ultrasound, and I was like, okay, that's really promising. And so I started Googling ultrasound age spirits, and I actually found a commercial tech. So it's a company called Hilsha.com. I can show it actually. So they've created a machine that uses ultrasound to basically speed up the maturation process, and it works. It works pretty well, actually. So it does age the alcohol in the sense that it reduces the harshness of the alcohol, makes it easier to drink, adds the flavors from the oak, all that kinds of stuff. So I thought this was really interesting.
And how many of them have you had today? Can we purchase these? Hilsha.com. Spirits. Well, rich flavors by ultrasound.
So what I found interesting was that I then went to YouTube and I was like, okay, surely there's home brewers doing this shit. And I actually found a bunch of home brewers that are doing this. So you can just buy a commercial or a personal ultrasound cleaning system. So let me show you this YouTuber.
And then just use it to brew.
Yeah, use it to mature your alcohol. So this is just a regular ultrasonic cleaner, right? You can buy this from the store. And then he fills up his... Where does he do it? Yeah, so he's got his jars, and they're filled with wood chips, and then you fill it with alcohol. And you throw these jars into the ultrasonic system, and you get something like this that comes out. And
How long does that take?
30 minutes to 3 hours.
What?
Yeah.
That's nuts.
And his taste test was this tastes really great. This is actually working. And so I thought this was interesting. People are clearly using this, and it makes sense. And I can kind of see the commercial applications of this. I think it'll be a different market. It's not going to be...
Yeah, of course.
Premium whiskeys will still be a premium. But, mass manufactured whiskeys like this makes sense.
Premium comes from scarcity to some degree, right? And so being able to mass produce an exact flavor every time is actually antithetical to how a lot of these whiskeys get their pricing, because what happens is you'll have batches go through, and a certain batch will have a certain profile and become renowned for being a particular way, and people know that that's going to be hard to replicate if ever, and so that batch becomes sought after. It happened with Yamazaki 18. There was a particular batch that got released 4 years ago now, 3 years ago, that got incredibly popular, and obviously they only had a certain number of barrels of it, and so it started skyrocketing. It became worth almost twice what a standard barrel of Yamazaki 18 was worth. And obviously, if you had just the ability to replicate the exact flavor every single time, the retailer stops having that as a brand or whatever you want to call it.
Yeah, but you're still fixated on the use case of collectability and uniqueness, whereas some people are just trying to get lit. They're just trying to.
You can get lit on good whiskey. Come on. Is anyone really spending less than $1,000 on a bottle of whiskey these days?
Sure. Yeah, true. Yeah. Although you may be out of touch, I'm not sure. Anyway, this is my research into whiskey. Yeah, I thought it was really fascinating. The ultrasound thing was really cool, and to be honest, I don't want to expose Elton Spirits, but I feel like they're just using ultrasound. That makes so much sense after looking at what I've looked at.
Why does ultrasound work? What's it doing? What is the chemical process? Do you know, or is it just ultrasound?
Not really. I don't think I guess my thinking here is it just sort of speeds up the collisions between the molecules, right? That's the only real justification I can kind of think of, because typically what it would be using a very slow process of diffusion, right? Which is, I think, one of the slowest processes, right? Correct me if I'm wrong.
I mean, it's by definition the slowest, right? It's what happens if we do nothing.
Yeah. So I'm guessing that just speeds it up through intense just agitation, right? Yeah.
Okay. So it's it's a cool sciencey way of shaking it.
Yeah. Shaking it very, very fast. As you guessed, you were on the right track. You just had to do it at 20,000 or
So I'm going to
20
mix my
kilohertz.
protein shakes from now on. Just like put it in an ultrasound machine.
Should work by all theory. Anyway, that's what I got for you. I think it's cool. I think it's got commercial applications. If you're interested, I can totally see someone starting this and just like selling spirits and getting one of these machines, or just a ultrasonic cleaner and start brewing and aging your own spirits. Could be cool.
All right. Mine is nowhere near as in-depth, but I think it's still cool. So I want to talk about this company called Profluent. I don't know if you can see my screen. Sometimes we have issues doing screen sharing. Can you see what I'm sharing?
I cannot. I feel like this is why we switched to Riverside in the first place.
Yeah.
But I will
think
Google
you're right.
it. I can see it.
Yeah, let me send you the page that I want
OpenCrISPR
to look at. Yeah.
Yeah, I can see it.
Go actually click the learn more, and then you'll see
Okay, so once again, nice website. Big fan. As usual. Okay, so what am I looking at here?
Well, no, you're going to share your screen.
Oh yeah, I can do that.
Because I think mine doesn't even come through in the recording. There we go. All right, so read and write any class of proteins. So there's a particular... I think it's worth giving a little bit of background context, which is that there's a shit ton of stuff you can do in life sciences when it comes to artificial intelligence. But I think everyone is fairly comfortable with the idea at the moment that some of the biggest breakthroughs recently across the board in any field of AI has been transformers, right? Language, essentially, the ability to read and write different human languages. And that's because there's a really interesting sort of structure or like grammar to language that isn't typically the case in chemistry, or there's not a really great analogy between those two. But in proteins, there is a really good analogy of language, which it's the protein sequence. So there's only 20 possible amino acids. And so really there's sort of a limit in the diversity that you can have. Now, just like any English paragraph, that diversity explodes pretty rapidly, right? There's, if you had a 1,000-word essay, how many possible variations of that could you have? But not all variations are meaningful, right? If you just put 1,000 random words on a page, half of that's like 99.999% of the time, you're just going to get garbage that doesn't make any sense. It's very hard to get something that's grammatically correct. And so transformers had figured that out in English, and it turns out that they were also really good at doing that in proteins. And you can do that by basically looking at all of the proteins that we observe in nature and saying there are just some combinations of amino acids in certain sequences that we just don't see, right? Just like I don't know, the big green dragon, but you'd never hear someone say the green big dragon, right? Like it just feels wrong. And so there's an element of that just like in nature as well, in proteins, that transformers have been able to learn. And so people have started developing these transformers and these GPTs and these various kinds of artificial intelligence systems to try and, fold proteins to start with. That was the first attempt, is can you read the language and figure out what the structure is? But then people also started trying to say, well, can we read the sequence, maybe the structure as well, and predict the behavior? Like, what's it actually going to do behaviorally in the cell? Which is sort of analogous to saying, okay, I've got a grammatically correct sentence, but a grammatically correct sentence is different from understanding what the sentence means, right? If I said, AJ, give me a grammatically correct sentence, that's different from saying, AJ, give me a grammatically correct sentence that explains how your day was, right? That's a much more refined question. And so people have started being able to do that with proteins, where you can say, well, I don't just want a realistic protein. I want a realistic protein that's going to have a certain shape and it's going to have a certain function. Specifically, this group, if you scroll down a little bit further, they talk about gene editing, and they've created this thing called OpenCrISPR. So we've talked about CRISPR before, and CRISPR is essentially this protein complex that goes in and attaches itself to DNA, and it can pull out certain parts of genes and put in new ones. Now, depending on what part of the DNA you want to attach yourself to, what organism you're thinking about, where this gene is most highly expressed, you're going to have a slight variation of your CRISPR protein. And the various forms of CRISPR proteins are heavily patented. And so this group has done something really freaking cool, which is they've basically said, let's learn from the various proteins in nature, the various CRISPR things that we've seen in patents and in nature, in viruses and so on, and say, generate me one that hasn't been seen before. Generate me a novel protein sequence that isn't patent protected, that uses sequences that are, highly likely to be found in a human, which means that your immune system's probably not going to go so haywire, that aren't usually found in viruses. And again, so that will help your immune system not go haywire, but replicate the behavior of a CRISPR molecule. And so this group has created essentially an AI that can create gene editing proteins, and they've open sourced it, which is even cooler. So they've basically taken this and said everyone can have this gene editing software, or rather software to design proteins that are gene editing for free. And I think that's just really, really, really cool, because now if you want to go down the path of doing gene editing therapeutics, this huge patent IP barrier that used to exist has just overnight suddenly disappeared. And I think with recent FDA approvals of gene editing therapies and a recent growing interest, especially in the longevity community, around like self-experimenting with gene editing, things like OpenCrISPR are going to like just create a renaissance of how many companies can actually attempt to do this.
This is awesome. And also you explained it so well. I think that analogy with the sentences was really good. Like that made a lot of sense. And so I'm surprised, I guess I shouldn't be surprised, that a lot of the CRISPR proteins are patented. So correct me if I'm wrong, but you need a different, so if the CRISPR protein is like a pair of scissors that help you cut specific areas of the DNA, you need a different pair of scissors for every single segment of DNA that you would want to cut out, right?
It's not just that. So, I mean, you can think about it maybe as like 3 or 4 different elements, which is how do I locate the gene that I want to edit? That's the first part. So how does the protein say, that's the area in the massive genome that I'm trying to find and edit? The second is, how do I cut? The third is, what am I going to put in there? And how do I get it in there? And then the fourth is kind of like, how do I stitch back up again? Right? And you have a lot of trade-offs between, precision, uptake of the new gene, how good the cut is versus how likely you are to get the new gene to actually get stitched back in there. And so you're making all of these trade-offs and these balances. And then this other balance that you have to consider is, originally we discovered this in viruses, but you had to sort of like retrofit it, because if you just put a virus into a human, your immune system's going to be like, no thanks, I reject this. And so how do you design the protein such when you put it in a human, the immune system looks at it and says, yeah, that looks kind of normal. And maybe it's like disguised as something that would be in a human anyway. And a big part of that is basically just, again, it's learning the language. It's saying, what are human proteins? How do they usually talk? What do they usually say? And let's try and replicate that as much as we can. You can almost think of it like, I don't know, to draw some crude analogies, it's like an accent. It's like everyone's speaking the same language, but like you've got to use the accent for that particular species, because otherwise, the immigration officer at the gate's going to be like, no, I don't know. Like this guy is not from here. Like send him out. And you'll get all sorts of immune responses. It's called immunogenicity. And it's one of the key challenges with any kind of like biologic that you want to be delivering into a human.
Yeah, that's cool. I think my brain jumped to, okay, if they can disguise themselves, then theoretically there's harm that could be done through this too, right? Either
Absolutely.
through a malicious actor or are there naturally occurring proteins like this that can just...
Well, that's exactly what CRISPR does, right? Okay. That's how this virus works, is it rocks up, it cuts your DNA up and puts itself in there. It's like, yeah, I'm going to piggyback off your genome, thanks. Some massive percentage of human DNA is actually viral. It got into our genomes from viruses. My favorite one is the ARC1 gene, which is this gene in your brain that does interneuron signaling. And if you remove this in mice and animals, they lose all ability to do long-term memory, basically. So they can do short-term memory tasks, but they can no longer do long-term memory tasks. And so it's necessary. It's definitely not sufficient. Having ARC1 isn't good enough to just have long-term memory, but it demonstrates that like our ability to remember things over incredibly long periods of time is something we got in part from being infected by viruses. We co-evolve with viruses. It's not purely a, hostile back and forth. Some of it is co-evolutionary.
Do you know much about the company?
I know very little, and I tried to look a little bit deeper into them. Other than that, they've got some pretty good backers. So I guess some of the VCs that back them and some of the groups they work with are reasonably well reputed. They're pretty quiet. They don't have they're really pushing big on this OpenCrISPR is really the only thing that they talk about. And their team is quite young for the industry, which I think is good. But I'm biased.
Yeah, I think open source code, like, I like that people do it, and I'm appreciative for those who do it. But I don't know if if I could sit there and do open source stuff all day. Just because it doesn't seem. I mean, I guess it can be lucrative if you get the right backers and you figure out how to make the business model work.
I think that the key is trying to figure out where is your actual moat, like truly, and taking everything that isn't part of that and open sourcing it is actually a really good idea, because you build a lot of thought leadership. And this is something that hasn't really been understood in the life sciences space. And I think it's because uniquely in life science, or maybe more acutely felt, is that you have like 6 different groups that have to work together over 20 years, handing off the baton to each other person in order for a therapeutic to ever actually get developed. And the failure rate is like 999 in 1,000. And so people get really cagey about every little step. But a lot of these steps they're not moats, right? Like the ability to do what these guys have done, I don't actually think it's a moat. Like models are not a moat. The protein language domain is getting pushed forward by open source and researchers and everything. So it's like build up the thought leadership and figure out what is your real moat. And probably the moat is the ability to know which genes to edit in the first place. And then the ability to actually edit them stops being interesting pretty quickly.
Yeah, makes sense. Anything else you want to touch upon with this company?
Not really. I just thought it was cool. Yeah.
Yeah, this is really cool.
Where their license is super simple. Like it's basically don't be an asshole, like don't do anything unethical with the software and then you're all good. So even commercial applications. So we're going to dive deeper into the license and then include it in our platform to make it easily accessible so people don't have to install it. They can just say, I want you to design CRISPR, and then it will do it.
Yeah, cool. We should bring them on the pod if they're down to do it.
Why not? Yeah.
Yeah.
I'll reach out.
This is my open invite if you're listening by some miracle. Okay, what else you got for me?
I had so not even a 180, like a 180 done 6 times. The other thing that I stumbled across was something called a virtual power plant. What do you think that is?
Okay, I was just about to Google it. Virtual power plant. You know what? This kind of sounds like a crypto thing. If I was to just guess off the bat,
I can see why you went there. So it's also got another name.
Okay.
It's called a distributed energy resource management system.
Yeah, that makes me think. Although I feel like the word distributed has been ruined, right? Like in some sense.
Maybe for people like us that have been too long in the industry. I don't know if normal people have this issue. Let me all right, we're gonna cut all this crap out again, but I'm just gonna send you the link. It's not a super there's not a website for this.
Wait, what did you say? Distributed energy production?
Distributed energy resource management system.
So
is I guess the software stack within this concept of a virtual power plant.
So I guess my mind goes to the solar providers who are like, just homeowners that are giving energy back to the grid and like sort of managing all of that.
That's exactly right.
Okay.
So it basically, but it's a little like there are different versions of this. And to me, one of the most interesting ones is that if you just give energy back to the grid, that's not necessarily super useful because the grid can only store so much capacity. And so you help the grid build up that capacity in periods where it may not be able to build it up otherwise. But what it doesn't do is help offset like peak demand, right? When suddenly everyone's drawing from the grid. And so the way that, or the problem that virtual power plants are trying to solve is to reduce these peaks by essentially saying, if we're both connected to the grid, there should be a mechanism whereby I can send to you directly the energy that I'm harvesting through, like my solar panels or whatever it is. And there are many different, I guess, like types of this. So, you've got the system where like a utilities company enrolls a customer that's already part of like their company and they plug it in and they manage everything. Or you even have the manufacturers themselves. So this would be companies like Tesla, for example, that have the Tesla wall, right? And then they have their own programs that you can sign up and just kind of skip the utilities company directly. And then you have maybe just the software providers, the typical, like we have some cool cloud software that figures this all out and coordinates it. And then they team up with the utilities providers and they provide this service through the cloud. So you have these like IoT devices in your house that are harvesting energy from various places. And then you sort of like uplink all of that information to some cloud platform that figures out the different usage loads and is trying to predict where they're going to start peaking and starts funneling energy into those areas instead of centralizing it all the way to the grid. I actually thought that was really cool, like really, really cool. So maybe there'll come a day where we no longer have centralized grids, and we just have these lots of mini grids all over the place, which are also much less vulnerable. I mean, it's the same thing that decentralization of finance always, similar methodology, right? Just like how many points of failure do you have? Do you have one big grid that does it all? Super efficient, but if it goes down, you're fucked. Or do you have 100 of these little grids that are much less efficient, but it's harder for 100 grids to all go offline simultaneously? And I'm sure they're beyond just natural disasters. You've got military implications of things like this, where if your country is under attack, how easy is it to destroy your entire energy grid? Do you have to hit 100 locations? How peaceful, they call it graceful degradation. How graceful is the shutdown of your service? If you have a single centralized power plant, it's either 100% or 0%, right? Whereas if you have 100 of them, little mini ones, then you can scale all the way up smoothly between 100 to 1%.
What was the problem that you were saying before? How if you send all the energy back at the same time, it spikes and they can't store it anywhere. Is that what you said?
Well, so during peak demand, there's only so much capacity the central grid has, right? Yeah. Like in terms of like how much it can store that it has previously generated. This is essentially like the battery problem. So during down periods, right, where there's not a huge demand, so like at nighttime or like, I don't know, in the afternoon where it's not super hot on, an autumn day, not many people are using their power. So they've got a lot of excess power. And so they send that back to the grid to be stored, right? But the issue is that there's not really, there's only so much. Once you hit 100% storage capacity, that's it, right? You're kind of done. And so once you've hit 100% storage capacity, where does the excess go? If you don't have one of these virtual power plants, the excess just gets lost. But what you want to do is just say, well, don't send it to the central grid, send it next door to your neighbor directly and just let them use it. And it also means during peak periods, instead of the central grid having to burn a ton more fossil fuels, anyone that has excess can just send it directly to that person that needs it.
Right. Okay. So right now, if I have excess power, because my father-in-law does this, where he has his solar panels, and then when he has excess, he sends it back to the grid. Although I don't know what that actually meant, right? So I'm guessing it goes to a centralized place. What you're saying is we need software that allows you to reroute it to neighbors instead of going all the way back to a centralized
Exactly.
source. Okay.
Yep.
Interesting. Is anyone working on this that you saw?
Yeah, there are tons of companies. So like Tesla has its own thing going on where they've got programs like this. There's a group called, they've got some auto bidding system. There's this company called Virtual Peaker, which in the US is like teamed up with a bunch of different utilities providers to try and provide this. And they like suck in information from like thermostats and water heaters and EV chargers and like every little thing in your house that could correlate with your usage of energy, so they can tell which houses are like ramping up and which houses aren't. So, if AJ's house is suddenly ramping up and Loong's house is, I'm away on holiday, you want to be able to make sure that our mutual neighbor in the middle is routing to you, not routing to me, right? And so you're trying to preempt this and predict it as well. Because obviously you kind of have to preempt this. You need to have the power before you can use the power. So yeah, it's there are companies already doing this. There's even attempts to standardize it. So I think there's something called the Open Grid interface, which is like essentially some standardized protocol for how this should be done, so that different providers can all be intercompatible. It's probably too early for that though. People always try to make standards before it makes sense to make standards.
Yeah. Pika Energy was doing solar plus storage solutions for residential and commercial renewable energy markets, but they were acquired in 2019 by generic, interestingly enough.
Okay, that is pretty cool.
When did you hear about it?
I read about this just the other day. I was talking about Virtual Peaker.
Virtual
different
Peaker.
Company. Yeah.
Okay. It's weird that like it was so similar though. They did solar storage as well.
Yeah, so they I think they've got partnerships with the Pacific Gas and Electric Company, and they've got like some 525 batteries that they're aggregating across different like providers from like Tesla and Sonnen and things like that, and convincing those third-party customers to come onto their platform.
If you're an enterprising deep tech entrepreneur, any opportunities you see from any of the three ideas that we talked about?
I mean, I think the easier start is certainly just being the layer on top of these different things, right? If you can make this a system that's super effective, and it's going to come down to efficiency, right? Like if you can earn $1 per unit of energy from me, but only 90 cents of, from someone else, and my product is easier to use, you'll go with me. So I'm not even sure how deep techy it is. I really think that because you're kind of dealing with direct to consumer, it's about really, really beautiful product experience. And I use the word experience in the sort of broader sense, not just like the app itself, but also like how much money you're practically getting from this thing. And so the margins will get raced away to zero. So I think eventually you do end up having to be like a physical provider as well.
What about in the CRISPR space or the OpenCrISPR?
Oh man, huge opportunities. I think like the biggest opportunities are for the people that are doing target discovery. So for the groups that are trying to figure out. No, my company's not in target discovery. Yeah. Other companies discover targets and they come to us and we help them figure out how viable it is to actually drug those targets. But if you have a unique target and it's difficult to drug using other mechanisms. So for example, a mutation may cause an otherwise functional protein to suddenly become this globular, sticky mess. And there's nothing to grab onto. If you can just imagine like a ball, there's nothing to grab onto that a typical drug could use. And so now you can go deeper to the root problem and say, well, instead of trying to drug the mutant protein, why don't we fix the gene that's creating this mutant protein in the first place? That's essentially what they did with sickle cell anemia. They said instead of trying to destroy the mutant, I think it's hemoglobin, that's not going to work, because even if you destroyed it, you're going to end up in this situation where having no instance of this protein is not better than having just mutant instances of this protein. You need to restore the actual function. Doing that with small molecule therapies and RNA therapies is borderline impossible. But doing it with a gene therapy is very, very possible. And I think platforms like OpenCrISPR suddenly make that commercially viable. So I think if you're a researcher working on targets that need restoration of function as opposed to inhibition of function, this changes the game. Yeah. And you should be sitting up straight and paying attention to this.
Do you see any opportunities for individual contributors? Like, I've just downloaded the OpenCrISPR and I'm playing with it. Can you even play with it as an individual?
Yeah, absolutely. If you're slightly techie inclined, yeah.
Any opportunities there that you see that someone could start? I'm thinking like university student just playing with it.
Oh yeah, for sure. I mean, like you could design gene editors that you could then test in cell lines and things like that just for fun. Obviously, you should not put that in your body. But yeah, I mean, you can test it out for sure, yeah.
Cool. Anything else you want to add in this episode?
No.
Cool. I like it. So we talked about the Holotle from Disney. Then we talked about aging spirits rapidly using ultrasonic. Then we talked about OpenCrISPR and how they've open sourced a model to come up with CRISPR proteins, which is cool. And then we ended it on virtual power plants, which is not a crypto thing. So, yeah.
But if it is, the token's obviously going to be VPP.
Yeah, no, it makes so much sense. I actually think that would probably be a thing. For sure.
Someone's going to try and cryptofy that.
All right. Well, VPP is not virtual power plant. It's virtual poker price.
Of course.
All right, guys.
Creating a cryptocurrency that represents like internet degenerate gambling is so meta. So, contrary to popular belief, we can actually live, sleep, and eat off of likes and subscribes. So, if you've been enjoying what we're doing and you've been learning something, please like, please subscribe, please share it with your friends and people that you want to appear smart to. And that really helps us grow and eat and survive. And that's really the best way that you could possibly pay for this podcast, which is otherwise delivered to you free of charge.
All right, guys. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next week.